My mother's hand was shaking when she reached for the pen. My father leaned back in his chair, smiling that same cruel practice smile he'd worn my whole life. "Sign it, Elena. You should be grateful I'm even leaving you the car." The judge said nothing. The lawyer beside her didn't dare to breathe. And there I was, Sophie Hayes, standing behind her, watching 30 years of my mother's silence, about to be sealed with a single signature. He didn't even look at me when he added, almost amused, "Don't interrupt, Sophie. This is grown-up business." That was the moment something inside me broke and something else finally woke up. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a witness. And before the ink touched the paper, I stood up and said the one sentence that would end his empire. The courtroom in Denver felt like a vault airless, lined with old wood that had absorbed decades of whispered defeats. The ceiling fans hummed overhead, pushing around stale air that smelled of dust and worn paper. I sat in the back row among strangers, divorcing couples clutching folders, tired attorneys with silver pens, and a few quiet spectators who had come to watch other people's lives unravel. At the front of the room stood my father, Marcus Hayes. His face was flushed the way it always got when he felt in control. His skin a little too red, his grin a little too wide. He wore his victory like a cologne. The lawyer beside him adjusted his tie as if that might make the moment more respectable. My father's voice filled every inch of the room. "She'll walk out with her old car and the mortgage." He announced, each word sharpened to cut across the aisle. My mother sat rigid. Her pen slipped from her hand and rolled across the table. The lawyer representing her, an older man who looked exhausted by too many similar cases, didn't even try to stop the scene. My mother reached for the pen again, her hand trembling. When she looked up, her eyes seemed almost colorless. My father chuckled and faced the judge. "I'm being generous, Your Honor. She should be grateful. I could have taken everything." A few people in the gallery laughed under their breath. The sound scraped against the walls and lingered cruel and hollow. I watched my mother's shoulders fall inward, her chin dipped low as if the weight of 3 decades had finally pressed her down. The pen hovered over the signature line like a white flag. Each thud of my heartbeat carried a memory, the dinners where no one spoke unless he allowed it. The way silence became a language in our house, and how my mother learned to survive by disappearing into it. The moment stretched thin. I heard the whisper of the paper as she began to sign, and something inside me snapped taut. My chair scraped against the floor when I stood, the sound slicing through the quiet like a blade. "Your Honor," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was steady enough to make every head turn. The judge, a gray-haired man with half-moon glasses, looked up startled. He frowned as though interruptions were against the laws of gravity in his courtroom. "I have one item for the court's consideration." From the corner of my vision, my father's expression shifted from amusement to irritation. He turned toward me, eyes narrowing, voice dripping with condescension. "Sophie, what on earth are you doing? Sit down. This isn't your business." I didn't sit. I stepped forward, heels clicking against marble. I held out a plain manila envelope, the kind that had passed through my hands 1,000 times before, but never with stakes like this. The judge's brows knitted together. He took the envelope as if unsure whether to open it or order me out. The room was still. Even the ceiling fan seemed to pause. My father's lawyer cleared his throat, muttering something about procedure, but no one moved. My father folded his arms, trying to look unfazed, but a vein pulsed at his temple. I could feel the light from the high windows behind me, bright and cold, landing on that envelope like a spotlight. Inside it lay everything he didn't want the world to see. Everything my mother didn't know existed. Everything that would change what this room believed about him. I met my mother's eyes for the first time that day. She looked small, lost, but beneath her shock, I saw the faintest flicker, something that looked like hope, fragile and unfamiliar. The judge adjusted his glasses, his voice level. "Miss Hayes," he said slowly. "What is this?" For a breath, I couldn't speak. Then I said, calm and certain, "The truth." My father shifted in his seat, muttering my name again, but the words no longer carried power. The judge rested the envelope on his desk. He hadn't opened it yet, but the balance in the room had already changed. My father's confidence wavered. My mother's trembling stopped, and I realized that once the seal broke, no one in this courtroom, least of all my father, would ever leave it the same again. When I left home the first time I told myself I was running towards something, I did not realize how much I was running away from. The house on the hill was a place where voices had registers his loud everyone else low, and survival meant learning which conversations to avoid. Leaving felt like stepping out of a pressure cooker into thin clean air. At 26, I took a job nobody in my family could understand. And for the first time in my life, I was free to love the thing I did without it being turned into a punchline. My work is built out of margins and decimals. I spend my days staring at columns of numbers until they resolve into a language that refuses to lie. In a windowless office that smells faintly of burnt coffee and printer toner, I trace the routes that money travels through shell entities, straw men, and jurisdictions designed to vanish. I read bank memos the way other people read novels. A misdated transfer or a mismatched beneficiary is a plot twist, and every anomaly wants explaining. Precision is a kind of mercy. When you narrow the world to fact, emotions become a complication you can manage. He used to make a joke about it at parties, an offhand line delivered with a slap on my shoulder that was always meant to show how little he thought of what I did. My little accountant with a badge, he would say, as if the badge were a costume and not a responsibility. The guests would chuckle and move on. To them, it was a family gag. To me, it was a familiar cheapness, another attempt to reduce me to a novelty. I learned to smile, the smile that kept the peace. But behind that smile lived a stubborn registry of promises I would prove him wrong by doing the work he mocked, and I would do it without theatrics. There is a dark skill to forensic finance patience, a tolerance for tedium, a refusal to be seduced by the grand narrative of a man who believes his own press releases. My colleagues call methodical. They call the evidence I produce clean. A senior investigator once told me that cases like mine are the ones that burn the longest. You have to sit in the embers until the truth shows its shape. I have spent years learning how to sit in the heat without flinching. 3 years before any of this landed in my lap, I closed the case on a CEO who had flattened the livelihoods of dozens by laundering funds through a lattice of fake invoices and offshore trusts. I remember the last hour vividly, the handcuffs, the quiet resignation, and the man's voice as the cuffs clicked shut. There was no screeching, no threats, just a low admission that the paper had done the work for me. He said he felt defeated by the ledger more than by the badge, that he'd underestimated how lethal a dossier could be. I carried that line with me the way some people carry a photograph, sharp and instructive. It had become part of the story I told myself at night, that truth, when assembled patiently, was stronger than anyone's loudest lie. The two worlds, his and mine, ran on different currencies. His operated on posture and perception. My world ran on records and timestamps. In his sphere, influence was a cocktail party, a handshake, a press mention. In mine, influence was a footnote that led you to an account, which led you to a transfer, which led you to a beneficiary. Both forms of power alter people. One inflates, the other erudice what a scam was built on. I had learned to respect the latter because it could dismantle the former without spectacle. So when my mother called in a voice that trembled like a string ready to snap, I listened. She never asked for help unless she was out of options. So, I knew whatever she handed me would be more than paperwork. She said my father was pressing her to sign some final papers, that a lawyer came with a folder, and that she felt pushed in a way she had not felt in years. Her words were measured the way she had always learned to speak around him, polite, apologetic, and small. I told her I would come home. The promise was automatic. Reflexive blood is complicated that way. But underneath it, there was another current. A professional curiosity that had nothing to do with loyalty and everything to do with pattern recognition. A family dispute is one thing. A family dispute that follows a tax avoidance playbook is another. My mother was not the first person to be coaxed into signing away her legal standing. I had seen the fingerprints before, the slight shifts in corporate names, the last-minute transfers, the odd intermediary that serves only to make an ownership trail disappear into fog. If he was doing what my instincts told me he might be doing, this was exactly the sort of deliberate small cruelty my toolbox was built to expose. I told her to keep everything she had in a plain folder. Don't sign anything you don't understand. Photograph everything. And most important, if she felt afraid, I told her to call me first. Don't let the lawyer rush her. She thanked me the way people do when they are relieved to hear an adult voice on the line. And I booked the earliest flight out of the city. I did not pack like someone going on vacation. My bag held a laptop with encrypted drives, printed copies of federal procedures I knew by heart, and a small leather notebook where I kept the shorthand that turned a messy case into a coherent narrative. I think some part of me expected a scene, an argument, a desperate plea, a physical confrontation where truth would push into the open like sunlight. Instead, I found myself stepping back into a house that had not changed its habits, where his voice still claimed the room, even when he wasn't speaking, and where my mother moved through the kitchen as if the years of being made small had finally become a second nature. As I crossed the threshold, the house felt like a set I had once left, and yet it also felt like a battlefield, where I was coming back to serve in a different capacity. I had not planned to be a warrior for family loyalty. I had trained to be a proceduralist, a technician of accounts and affidavit, yet logic and love sometimes make strange allies. I was going home armed with both. That night, I spread my mother's documents across the kitchen table and began the work I do best, mapping connections, lining dates against receipts, tracing the faint, insistent paths of money. Each name that turned up in the records tugged a wire in the web I had learned to read. The more I looked, the clearer a pattern became, one I would later see in federal files and offshore registries. It was the kind of pattern that made my stomach tighten and my hands move faster. It was the kind that says someone has been busy building a comfortable exit strategy while leaving someone else to bear the cost. I sat there until the house grew quiet. My mother slept with a lamp on in the living room as she had for years, a small island of light. I shut my laptop and looked at the pile of papers with the composure of someone who knows how to assemble a strategy from fragments. In the morning, I would decide whether this was a family fight or a federal pattern. Either way, whatever I chose next would not look like rage. It would take the shape of evidence, and evidence does not need to shout to be devastating. When I left for the airport the next day, I took one last look at the empty porch. And told myself what I always tell before a difficult case: keep the facts close, let the rest fall away. I did not know then that the world I had stepped back into would demand everything I had learned in both worlds, the quiet, meticulous craft of my work, and the lonely, stubborn courage that comes from being underestimated for decades. The Oak and Barrel Steakhouse glowed with the kind of warmth that looks expensive until you notice the shadows. The light hit the rim of my wine glass and turned it the color of blood. Across from me, my mother sat with her hands locked together in her lap. She hadn't said a word since we sat down. My father arrived last, exactly as he liked to, dress in a gray suit that fit his ego perfectly. He greeted the staff as if they were lucky to see him again, patting shoulders, calling first names he probably didn't remember, handing out charm like loose change. When he slid into the booth, the air shifted. The waiter brought his drink before he even ordered. He opened the leather folder on the table, pulled out a thin stack of papers, and placed them between the bread basket and the steak knives. His voice carried confident enough to include the tables around us. This is the final agreement, Elena. You'll keep the little house and your car. I'll make sure you're not left stranded. My mother didn't look at him. She looked at the papers as if they were a test she was bound to fail. I leaned closer and scanned the numbers. My pulse slowed, heavy and deliberate. Her share barely a sixth of what the company was worth. I tried to steady my voice. Dad, these figures don't add up. I've seen the registration forms. He cut me off with a dismissive laugh. Sophie, sweetheart, let's not drag government paperwork into a real man's business. This is the real world, not one of your accounting puzzles. The table laughed with him, the lawyer. A few of his associates. The waiter caught in the crossfire. I didn't. I looked at my mother. She still hadn't raised her eyes. She just nodded slightly, the gesture of someone who has survived too many storms by pretending they were only rain. By dessert, the air felt thick. My father toasted himself with another glass of wine. When it was over, I walked out first, needing distance from the smell of his cologne and the sound of his laughter. In the parking lot, under the cold yellow light of a street lamp, I opened my phone. While they settled the bill, I photographed every page of the document my mother had held. The papers were crisp, still warm from the printer. Back at the hotel, I set my laptop on the desk, uploaded the images, and began reading. On the very first page, one line froze me. ECS Ventures. LLC, 3 letters. E for Elena, C for Claire, my middle name. S for Sophie. It was the same order he'd used for our home Wi-Fi password years ago. A joke back then. A little secret of his empire. Now it looked like a monument to his arrogance. I searched the registry. The company was incorporated in the Cayman Islands. The listed agent was Victor Kessler, his closest friend, a man I knew from work, only because he'd once appeared in a federal brief about offshore tax evasion. I opened an old case file from 3 months earlier. A network diagram from an international ring we'd dismantled. I lined the charts side by side. The pattern was identical shell entities feeding into a trust. The trust channeling funds through insurance instruments. The final destination hidden in a private foundation. The laugh that escaped me wasn't amusement. It was disbelief turned cold. My father hadn't just underestimated me. He had walked straight into the kind of web I built for a living. ECS Ventures, I murmured. A shell company named after the family you were dismantling. Twist 1 had become impossible to ignore. ECS Ventures wasn't a business. It was a laundering vessel built from our initials. Then came Twist 2. Buried in the scanned attachments was a 2-year-old authorization form, my mother's signature at the bottom. She had signed over a minority stake to a new investor. She hadn't realized she was handing him the legal key to move the assets beyond her reach. I sat back in the chair, the laptop light cutting across the hotel wallpaper. Outside the city pulsed with quiet neon indifferent. Inside, everything narrowed to that one thought, sharp and crystalline. He thought I was his quiet daughter. He had no idea he'd just made me his prosecutor. I checked into a cheap room near downtown, the kind of place where the paint peels in corners, and the AC rattles like a loose hinge. There was a single desk lamp, a chair with a squeak, and the steady, thin smell of mildew that seemed to settle into the bedding. It was exactly the sort of anonymity I wanted, the kind of room that felt temporary enough to contain whatever secrets I was about to open. I set the folder my mother had given me on the desk and booted the laptop. The screen threw a blue rectangle of light across the wallpaper. For the first time in months, the files were not just paper. They were nodes, addresses, timestamps, and line items that could be read like threads into the fabric of a life. I created a blank spreadsheet and gave the project a name that felt ritual and clinical at once. Project Rem Marcus Elena Claire for the 3 names that kept appearing in the corporate footwork he'd engineered. It had the same cold economy as the rest of my work, an acronym, a code, a map. I began to trace Hayes Freight Holdings Incorporated registered in Utah, an address listed that when I pinged it returned nothing but a mailbox rental and a UPS label, Rocky Basin Transport LLC filed in Texas. The registration documents naming Victor Kessler as the managing agent, ECS Ventures LLC. The phrase crawled across my screen in bold when I opened the scanned pages. Incorporated in the Cayman Islands with funds cycling through 2 insurance instruments registered in Miami. Each entry was a small deliberate design shell company intermediary guardian fund and then the money's exit strategy. My fingers moved with a kind of automatic certainty. Line by line, I filled the spreadsheet account numbers, dates, amounts, beneficiary tags. The same pattern I had seen in other cases started to emerge like a repeated motif in a song. 4 transfers stood out. 4 wires each routed through seemingly innocent channels aggregated to $6.80 $8 million. The dates were small of timing. each one booked within days of filings and invoices. My father submitted as legitimate business expenses. One entry carried the note that made my stomach drop: a repair to a storage tank, coded in a way that matched the playbook I had traced before. Someone had run a fraud memo through the ledger, and then hidden the ledger under an invoice labeled repair and maintenance. In my world, a miscoded memo is rarely accidental. In his, a cleverly placed invoice is a shrug. The more I read, the more the gulf between our definitions of normal widened until it was a chasm. The Kessler connection made the hair along my arms stand up. I cross-referenced the account identifiers with a database I had helped curate years ago. A handful of the identifiers matched those attached to Kessler Logistics in a federal investigation file I had reviewed months earlier. That file had been the skeleton of a ring we dismantled: offshore trust straw accounts in Miami, insurance vehicles used for temporary concealment. Now it hugged my father's name. I encrypted the files. I made copies, signed them with the kind of metadata that only someone inside could appreciate, and then sent a sealed copy to my secure DOJ account and another to an emergency address I had set up for contingencies. It was not paranoia, it was procedure, it was also strategy. If this blew up, he would reach for the person he instinctively distrusted first. He would suspect the one person who had access, the one who had always been quietly present at his edges. Better that his suspicion be confused than focused. Outside my window, the city lights blinked against a dark sky. The coffee maker in the room coughed and steamed as I poured a bitter cup that tasted of late nights and old paper. The glow of the screen reflected on my face. I looked older, a little, hollowed by the lines in the work, but precise in a way I recognized as discipline. If justice had a face tonight, it would be a spreadsheet. If it had eyes, they would be a timestamp. I told myself this, not as an attempt to be righteous, but because the mechanism of it was what I trusted. Numbers didn't plead. Numbers did not excuse. Numbers, when properly analyzed, were cruel in the most useful sense. 3 days later, I drove out to Evergreen. The house looked smaller from the road now. Seasons had stripped it of some pretense. My mother moved about the kitchen like a measured ghost, pouring tea, as if it were a ritual. When I entered, she looked up with a softness that carried the weight of better days and worse ones mixed together. "Please," she said, "don't make me regret this," adding the kind of qualifier people who have been bowled by marriage learn to use. He is still your father, even if you do what you must." I felt the tug in my chest. Blood is a real thing. It is also messy. I offered reassurances I hoped would be honest. "Tell me everything. Take pictures of anything he gives you. Do not sign and do not let anyone rush you." She listened and nodded the way people do when they have been practicing consent to small freedoms. There is a different courage in learning to accept a polite request over a season of fear. That evening, an email arrived at my desk. Subject line: TUR, an urgent Kessler case, suspected link to Hayes Freight. The message contained a TUR briefing. Kessler Logistics had moved funds that in pattern and account signature corresponded to entries now connected to Hayes Freight. Someone at the bureau had noticed the same identifiers I had. The notification was clinical flagged, priority code red, and sent to a distribution list that included my unit. I read it once, twice. There was no room for rhetorical flourish, just the facts. If the bureau was seeing the same connections, then this had quietly escalated beyond family land and into the domain where indictments live. It is one thing to catch a small domestic fraud. It was another to be part of dismantling an international apparatus that used family copyright as camouflage. If this case moved any further, my mother's documents would be scrutinized by forensic accountants who did not care about domestic sympathy. A signature on the wrong paper could implicate her as an unwitting participant. When I pulled the corporate filings again with that cold, professional eye, I found something that barreled through any residual mercy I might have held. A form from 2018 bearing my mother's name, a simple authorization to transfer shares to a new investor. On the surface, it was an administrative footnote. In practice, it handed legal control into the palms of a man who had been consistently present in the shadow work of their corporate life. Vic Kessler had signed on as an appointed agent. The authorization appeared routine until you considered the timing and the subsequent movement of funds. In a courtroom, evidence is not vindictive. It is material. The way documents aligned could turn an accusation into an obligation to act. If my mother's signature were read as consent, and the transfers were read as purposeful concealments, then the law had the power to treat her as complicit. The thought of that burned through me with chilly precision. He had not only robbed her pocketbook, he had stolen the clear ledger of her reputation. I sat down at the kitchen table and wrote 3 lines into my notebook. The kind of shorthand that in my world is a moral contract, not a checklist. 1. Establish asset concealment. Trace the $6.8 million with supporting timestamps and bank memos. 2. Protect Elena. Build an affirmative defense showing lack of knowledge and duress in signature authorization. 3. Keep it professional. No leaks, no shortcuts. The chain of custody must be unimpeachable. The rules were simple but absolute. This was not about retribution. It was about making sure the law punished the right intent and guarded the innocent. That night, curled under a lamp while my mother slept in the living room with the TV on low, I assembled a quiet report, appendices, copies, redactions, each document named and timestamped in a way that would survive scrutiny. I took nothing for granted. Evidence must be clean enough to speak when required and silent enough to protect until the moment it must be heard. Late an anonymous email landed in my inbox. Someone from inside DOJ is already looking into him. Be careful. The line contained no signature, no confirmation, no comfort, but it changed the pitch of my solitude into something less solitary. If there was already a thread being pulled from inside, then my risk was shared. If not, then at least a warning had been sent where it would matter. I read the message twice and then closed the laptop. For the first time since I had walked back through the front door of the house that had raised me, I felt a rawness that was not just professional. It was personal in a way I could not tidy with memos or directive codes. He had not taken only accounts. He had tried to engineer a narrative to make the absence of justice appear as an agreement. He had tried to turn a signature into a razor. I slept poorly that night, but not from fear. I slept because the strategy had finally aligned with the impulse. I had learned how to turn patterns into prosecution, how precision could look like inevitability. I would not shout at him. I would not storm his offices. I would let the architecture of law and ledger reveal what he had tried to bury. In the morning, I would begin the work of transforming papers into proof, and proof into protection for the woman who had taught me gentleness, even though gentleness had rarely been returned. Outside the house settled into ordinary sounds. A refrigerator. Hum. A distant truck. The low patient breathing of someone who is used to surviving by a very small light. Inside I made a final entry in the notebook. It was short and it read like a vow rather than a plan. Act precisely. Act quietly. Let the evidence do the damage. Sleep refused to come. The air in the room was stale with the scent of old coffee and ink like every case file I'd ever closed bleeding into this one. On the desk lay weeks of my life bank statements, corporate charters, wire confirmations, notarized translations from the Cayman Islands and one highlighted page from the U.S. Code 18 U.S.C. Stone 1621 perjury under oath. Each document was a fragment of the same weapon. I stacked them carefully, sealed them in a thick manila envelope, the kind we jokingly call the bullet made of paper. It sat in the center of the table, unassuming and lethal. I stared at it for a long time. He used to say, I spent my life counting other people's money. Tomorrow, he'd learned that numbers could kill lies faster than any bullet. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. A message from Agent Bryant, my old supervisor at the Federal Financial Crimes Unit. Whatever you do tomorrow, make sure your paperwork can stand in any court. I typed back a single word. Always. Outside Denver was quiet streets blanketed in frost and anticipation. I grabbed my coat keys and the envelope, then drove toward Evergreen to the house I once called home. The windows still glowed from within that same soft yellow light my mother had always preferred. She was sitting by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her profile turned toward the dark. Time had softened her, but the sadness in her face hadn't aged. It had fossilized. I stopped the car at the edge of the drive, engine idling. For a moment, I thought of going in, but there are goodbyes you make from a distance. Tomorrow, I whispered through the glass. I'll give you back what he stole, your dignity. Snow began to fall, the kind that floats more than it lands. The town looked like it was holding its breath. When I got back to the motel, an automated notification waited in my inbox. Subject: Federal Asset Freeze. Kessler Logistics. Status: Warrant executed. Subject in custody. My eyes lingered on the words. Vic Kessler had been arrested. The ripple would reach my father within hours. It meant the court would force him to disclose every asset tied to Kessler, and I knew Marcus Hayes well enough to know he'd lie. Twist 1. Tomorrow under oath he would commit perjury. 5 minutes later my phone rang from a blocked number. You don't know who you're dealing with. Ms. Hayes. A man's voice said, measured low. Not quite a threat, but close. Then the line went dead. I stared at the phone, the reflection of the envelope still gleaming on the desk. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, I said softly. I poured the last of the coffee into the sink, packed up the files, and laid out the navy blue uniform I hadn't worn in years. The silver insignia on the shoulders caught the light. I didn't wear it for show. I wore it to remind myself which side I was on. The snow outside thickened into a quiet veil. I turned off the lamp, slid the envelope into my leather case, and stood by the window one last time. Tomorrow the court would see numbers and paperwork, but for me it would be the sound of 30 years of silence breaking open. Justice was never loud, but tomorrow it would speak in my voice. Morning settled over Denver like silence after a storm. Snow covered the courthouse steps in a thin white layer reflecting the pale winter light. I arrived early, long before the crowd. The building loomed against the horizon. Glass and steel gleaming under the sky. But inside the air was heavy anticipation thick enough to feel. People moved in and out of the corridors, their voices echoing off marble. Reporters murmured, cameras clicked. Lawyers shuffled files that all sounded the same. I stood by the window at the end of the hall, watching the light spill through the glass, fractured but bright. Beneath the noise, there was a strange calm inside me, as if every nerve had agreed to stay still until justice spoke for itself. By the time the bailiff called the session to order, the courtroom was packed. The press had filled the benches, eager to watch the public unmaking of a man they had once called Colorado's self-made legend. My father entered the room as though it were another stage. The same gray suit, the same measured swagger. His smile had the kind of confidence that could fool a crowd, but not a daughter, who had grown up counting the cracks in it. Beside him, his attorney, Julian Vance, whispered last-minute reassurances, Colorado's best closer, a man whose reputation rested on making liars look credible. When my father's eyes found me sitting near the front, he grinned. Well, Sophie, he said casually, voice carrying just enough for the room to hear. Here to support your mother. Are you good? Big day for the family. I nodded once. Yes, sir. A very big day. The words sounded polite, but they settled like a fuse. Judge Thorne presided from the bench, a man whose calm could silence a room. His military posture betrayed years of discipline. Even the way he raised his pen had weight. Vance stood first, presenting the asset report with smooth, rehearsed confidence. Your Honor, Mr. Hayes has made full and transparent disclosures as required by state law. Thorne glanced down at the papers, then at my father. Mr. Hayes, do you swear under oath that these disclosures are complete and accurate to the best of your knowledge? My father straightened his voice, clear, rehearsed. Absolutely, Your Honor. All of them, the judge pressed. Every cent, he said, smiling like he'd already won. I rose from my seat. My voice didn't shake. Your Honor, Sophie Hayes, Federal Financial Crimes Division. I have material evidence of perjury and asset concealment relevant to these proceedings. The silence that followed was electric. Every head turned. Cameras clicked, then stopped. My father's chair scraped the floor as he half stood. Sophie, sit down. This isn't your place. His lawyer shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. She has no standing in this matter. Judge Thorne raised a hand. Approach Miss Hayes. I walked forward, the sound of my heels echoing through the room. I set the thick manila envelope on the bench before him. This contains evidence of undeclared offshore accounts and fraudulent conveyance through a company called ECS Ventures. Thorne opened it. The paper whispered as he flipped through the pages, each line of print a blade. The air grew taut, so quiet that the turning of a single sheet seemed to cut it open. Then came at the smallest sound, but heavy enough to shift the balance of the room. A laugh, low and disbelieving, from the judge himself. The crowd held its breath. Oh, Mr. Hayes, Thorne said at last, amusement laced with something colder. You really shouldn't have named your shell company after your wife and daughter. The words landed like a gunshot. My father froze, his face drained of color. That's not possible. It is, Thorne replied evenly. And it's documented. 8.7 million transferred offshore under your signature. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously. My father stumbled back into his chair, mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. Vance slumped beside him, pulling out his phone, whispering into it with the desperation of a man realizing the story had already escaped him. The doors at the back opened. 2 court-martials stepped in, silent and ready. Thorne lifted his gavel. This court finds Mr. Hayes in contempt. All assets are hereby frozen, and the case is referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. My father lurched forward, his composure cracking, sweat beaded on his forehead, his hands trembling. She's my daughter, he shouted, voice raw. She's my daughter, and she's turning on her own blood. Thorne didn't even look up from the papers. She's not your daughter here, Mr. Hayes. She's the law, he gestured toward the marshals. My father's words dissolved into muttering as they took him by the arm. I didn't move. I watched silent as 30 years of arrogance collapsed in a single afternoon. Then Thorne looked at me, the sternness in his expression softening just slightly. Miss Hayes, he said, your evidence is the cleanest audit I've seen in 20 years. Justice appreciates precision. I nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. My eyes found my mother's. She was crying, but her tears weren't of fear or shame anymore. They were light, trembling, released. For the first time, she wasn't bowing her head. She was watching the end of her cage being dismantled. And for the first time, I understood that victory didn't have to roar. It could arrive as quietly as a single signature meeting the truth. The courtroom felt weightless in its silence, like the air itself was holding its breath. Judge Thorne raised his gavel and struck it 3 times, the sound reverberating through the oak panels, like the echo of a verdict already written. Each strike landed with the finality of a door closing, a coffin sealing shut over a dynasty built on deceit. When the echo died, he spoke clearly, his tone firm, but without cruelty. Mr. Hayes, this court hereby nullifies all prior settlements. All domestic and offshore assets are frozen pending federal review. The words fell like ice. Across the room, my father's jaw locked. For a moment, he sat still as if the meaning hadn't reached him yet. Then his voice erupted sharp and ragged, shattering the calm. She's my daughter. She can't do this to me. Thorne didn't flinch. His eyes were steady. His voice even colder than before. She didn't. He said, each syllable a blade. The law did. It was strange, the stillness that followed. Everything inside me slowed like the room was underwater. The adrenaline that had carried me this far drained away, leaving only clarity. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't even angry. I was simply done. My father slumped into his chair. The confidence drained from him like air from a punctured tire. His hands clawed at his temples as if he could hold together what was left of his pride. Beside him, his attorney Vance stared down at the table, a man who'd already seen his name slipping from tomorrow's headlines. Two federal officers approached. They didn't need to say a word. Authority moved with them like gravity. One placed a hand gently on my father's shoulder. He didn't resist. The color in his face had already gone. For a moment, I wanted to look away. Maybe some instinct from childhood, a reflex that still wanted to protect him from humiliation. But I didn't. He had built this. Every signature, every lie, every dollar buried overseas was a brick in the wall that now enclosed him. My mother sat at the plaintiff's table, trembling, but upright. Tears streaked her face, yet her expression held something I hadn't seen in years. Peace. Not victory, just release. The kind that comes when you finally realize the monster in the story was never immortal, just loud. I walked over and took her hand. Her skin was warm. Her fingers soft from age and years of careful restraint. "It's over, Mom," I whispered. She looked at me, her eyes glistening but steady. "No," she said quietly, the hint of a smile breaking through her tears. "It's finally fair." A breath caught in my throat. It wasn't justice for her. It was balance, something rarer, something that couldn't be measured in money or rulings. Then, as the officers guided my father toward the door, he jerked back once more, his voice ragged with disbelief. "You'll regret this, Sophie. No one in this world forgives blood that betrays blood." His words hung in the air like smoked dense bitter, already fading. I looked straight at him, my voice calm, even gentle. "Justice doesn't need family, Dad. It only needs truth." The officers led him away. His footsteps echoed down the marble corridor until there was nothing left but silence. Judge Thorne gathered his papers, then turned to my mother. "All $8.7 million recovered from the fraudulent accounts will be awarded to Mrs. Elena Hayes as punitive compensation." No one moved. Even the reporters stayed quiet. The judgment landed heavier than any gavel strike. Thorne looked down once more, his tone final. "We are done here." He struck the gavel one last time, clean, decisive. The sound rolled through the room like thunder muffled by snow. I helped my mother to her feet. As we walked toward the door, light poured through the tall windows, splintered by the snow outside. The sunlight hit my uniform, glinting off the silver insignia on my shoulder. My mother squeezed my hand, and I felt the faintest tremor in her grip, one not of fear, but of freedom finally taking shape. We passed the gallery, the murmurs beginning to rise behind us. The whisper of cameras' pens scratching the noise of a story already taking flight. But their words no longer mattered. For once, the truth didn't belong to the world. It belonged to us. At the threshold, I paused, listening. My heels clicked against the marble floor, slow and steady. Each step syncing with my heartbeat. It was the rhythm of something ending the pulse of an old life folding into silence. Outside, the cold air met us like a baptism. The afternoon light had shifted to gold, turning the courthouse steps into a stage washed in forgiveness. I let my mother walk ahead, her coat fluttering against the wind, and for the first time she looked taller. I followed her down the steps, the echo of my footsteps mixing with the fading ring of the judge's gavel. Each sound was the same note, the same truth repeated in a different key. Behind us, the door closed. Ahead, the snow had already begun to melt. And as we crossed into the light, I realized that the sound of justice wasn't the gavel or the verdict. It was this quiet footsteps leaving the past behind. A year slipped quietly past, the kind of year that doesn't make headlines, but reshapes a life. Spring had come back to Denver, and with it the smell of rain and tulips. On a small street outside the city, a new sign hung beneath a trellis of purple flowers, Elena's Porch Cafe. The paint was still fresh, the door chimes still too bright, but the place felt like it had always belonged there. My mother moved between tables with A lightness I'd never seen in her. She laughed often, real laughter, not the careful kind she used to use when my father filled a room. Sometimes when the afternoon sun hit her hair, I could almost forget she was ever the woman who'd once trembled over a divorce decree. I sat in the corner near the window. My laptop opened, the hum of the espresso machine mixing with the low murmur of customers. The case that had devoured my life, Hayes Freight, was finally closed. The final report sat ready for submission, 1,000 pages, condensed into one truth. Justice had done its job. My mother came over carrying a plate and a steaming mug. "Sophie, have you eaten?" she asked, her voice soft, but no longer fragile. "I have," I said, smiling. "But I'll never say no to your coffee." She laughed, setting the cup down beside me. "It tastes better when no one's shouting in the background," she said. We both smiled at that. For the first time in a long time, silence didn't mean fear. It meant peace. I watched her move to the counter, greeting regulars by name. Correcting orders with playful scolds. Each interaction was an act of quiet defiance against the years she'd been told to stay small. I realized then that justice hadn't just restored what was stolen. It had given her something new, her own voice. The bell over the door chimed. I looked up, expecting another customer, but it was just the wind. Then my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a number I didn't recognize, but the message was unmistakable. "Sophie, the feds are taking everything. I'm losing it all. You know the law. Please help me." For a moment, my hands froze above the keyboard. I didn't need to check the sender. The phrasing was too precise, too transactional. Marcus Hayes. There was no sweetheart. "No, I'm sorry." Not even. "Please," that sounded human. Just the vocabulary of a man who had spent his life turning people into assets and emotions into liabilities. I reread it once, twice. Then I let the phone sit on the table for a long time, watching the message fade into the lock screen. I felt nothing, no anger, no satisfaction, not even pity, just a stillness that filled every corner of me. It wasn't numbness. It was peace. He wasn't reaching out to a daughter. He was reaching for a resource, for a loophole, for the one person who could maybe keep him from drowning in the law he'd mocked for so long. I turned the phone face down. He's not asking for a daughter, I thought. He's asking for a tool. The decision came easily. I opened the message one last time, held my thumb over the screen, and pressed block contact. The phone went dark. No sound, no vibration, just quiet. Across the room, my mother was telling a customer about the new lavender she wanted to plant by the porch. "They smell peaceful," she said, her eyes lighting up. I smiled. "They do." I called back. "Peace has a scent." The cafe door opened, letting in a rush of spring air and laughter. The world outside moved on, and for the first time, I let it. Later, driving home, I took the long route through downtown. The snow had melted, but the courthouse still stood stark against the skyline, solid, unflinching. I slowed as I passed it, my headlights glancing over the familiar facade. The third-floor window caught the last of the afternoon sun, a golden reflection spilling across the glass. That was where I'd stood a year ago, enveloping hand, the weight of an entire family's silence pressing against my ribs. Now the light there shimmered without memory, just light being light. I pulled over for a moment, letting the engine idle. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to walk back inside to revisit to justify. The law didn't need an audience, and neither did I. That was the quiet miracle of it all. Justice didn't always roar from a bench or echo through headlines. Sometimes it lived in small places, like a coffee shop run by a woman who finally laughed freely, or in the calm of a daughter who no longer needed to prove she was right. The city was alive outside my window, the hum of traffic, the soft pulse of people going on with their lives. None of them knew what had happened in that courtroom or how many nights it had taken to piece together the truth. They didn't need to. Justice doesn't depend on recognition. It depends on belief. I looked up at that window one last time, whispered quietly to myself. Sometimes justice doesn't need witnesses. It just needs someone brave enough to carry it through. The sun dipped behind the courthouse, turning the reflection to amber, then to nothing. I started the car, turned toward the open road and let the city disappear behind me. For the first time in years, there was no weight to carry, no unfinished sentence, no guilt, no noise, just peace. And yes, peace really did have a scent like lavender and rain, like coffee cooling in the afternoon light, like a life rebuilt in quiet honesty. The next morning, Denver shimmered under a clean sky. The snow that had covered the city for weeks had melted overnight, leaving the streets wet and gleaming like glass. The air smelled of thawed earth and coffee grounds, and sunlight poured down the way it only does after a storm, gentle, forgiving, alive. I drove through the suburbs, where the houses leaned into spring lawns, waking up from hibernation, windows open to let in the cold air that wasn't quite cold anymore. The road curved toward the edge of town where old trees arched over the street and shadows fell in soft shapes. When I turned the corner, the cafe came into view, Elena's porch, the lavender sign swaying lightly in the breeze. Tulips lined the walkway, their petals half open to the morning sun. I parked across the street and sat for a moment with the engine off, listening to the faint hum of the world. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask for attention, but rewards it. I stepped out of the car and the smell of roasted beans hit me instantly, warm and comforting. The bell over the door jingled as a customer left, balancing a to-go cup and a pastry wrapped in paper. Laughter drifted out from inside, blending with the music playing low on the radio. Through the window, I saw my mother behind the counter, arranging fresh flowers in a vase. The morning light fell across her face, touching the silver strands in her hair, and for a heartbeat time folded in on itself. The woman who used to hide behind silence now moved with quiet authority, giving instructions to an employee, smiling at a customer, wiping her hands on her apron like she'd been doing this her whole life. On the wall beside the register hung a small photo of me, uniform, pressed shoulders, straight eyes clear. It wasn't the one from the courthouse or any award ceremony. It was an older picture taken on a day I'd forgotten. She'd chosen it not because of what I wore, but because I was smiling. I caught my reflection in the glass door and smiled back. Not out of pride, but completion inside. She spotted me and waved. "Coffee?" she mouthed through the glass. I nodded, taking a seat at one of the wooden tables on the porch. The air was soft, carrying the scent of tulips and the faint sweetness of pastry dough baking inside. A sparrow landed on the railing, bold and curious before darting away. When she came out with 2 mugs, steam curling between us. She set one in front of me and took the seat across the table. "You're early," she said, smiling. "Couldn't sleep," I answered. She sipped her coffee and looked at the street. "That's not always a bad thing." "No," I said. "Not anymore." For a while we sat in silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. The city woke around us. A delivery truck rumbled down the road. A child on a scooter shouted something about breakfast. The breeze shifted and carried laughter from somewhere unseen. Then my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. Department of Justice promotion confirmed. Deputy Chief Investigator. I locked it before the notification could fade. The feeling that followed wasn't excitement. It wasn't pride. It was stillness. The kind that comes when every box has been checked, every weight set down. "Good news?" my mother asked, watching me over the rim of her mug. "Just work," I said. "Good, but quiet," she smiled knowingly. "Quiet isn't bad." "No," I said softly. "It's peace." She reached across the table and touched my hand, her fingers warm. "You've done enough fighting for both of us. Maybe it's time to let the world be gentle." I wanted to believe her for the first time. I think I did. After she went back inside, I opened my notebook. The pages were filled with old notes, case numbers, evidence logs, annotations from a year I would never forget. At the very end, there was one blank page left. I took out my pen and wrote, "Justice doesn't roar. It whispers in ink." I let the ink dry, closed the notebook, and set it beside my cup. The metal table caught the sunlight gleaming where once there had been tears, signatures, and folded documents. Now there was nothing but light. Across the street, a couple walked their dog, laughing about something trivial. A jogger stopped to tie her shoe. Life so ordinary went on, indifferent and perfect. The door of the cafe swung open again. My mother leaned out, calling Sophie. "Can you grab the signboard? I need to write today's special." I stood feeling the easy stretch of the morning in my bones and crossed to the sidewalk. She handed me a piece of chalk and said, "Make it neat. You always had better handwriting." I wrote, "Lavender latte, $425 in clean white strokes." She laughed, looking at it. "See, precise, just like your reports," I shrugged. "Old habits," she smiled. "Keep the good ones." When she went back inside, I stayed there, watching the light shift across the pavement. Cars past the tulips swayed in the breeze and the sound of clinking dishes floated through the open window. I thought about the courtroom a year ago. The smell of varnish, the echo of the gavel, the moment everything changed. But even that memory had softened. Justice had done what it was meant to do. Correct, restore, then fade. It didn't need to stay loud. The world had moved on. So had I. A warm gust lifted the edge of the notebook cover, still lying on the table, flipping it open to the final page. The inked line caught the sun. "Justice doesn't roar. It whispers in ink." The words seemed to glow before the wind turned the page again, closing it gently. I picked it up, tucked it under my arm, and turned toward the cafe. Inside, my mother was laughing again, her voice carrying above the espresso hiss and the chatter of morning regulars. I paused at the door, the scent of coffee and flowers wrapping around me. This, I thought, is what redemption sounds like. Not applause, not headlines, not revenge, just life continuing a little kinder than before. When I stepped inside, the bell above the door chimed softly like punctuation at the end of a long story. Outside, the sunlight spilled through the windows, catching on every polished surface. It touched the framed photo on the wall, the flowers on the counter, the steam rising from the cups, and me. For the first time in years, there was nothing left to fix, nothing to chase, nothing to fight. There was only light.